Hello, hello, hello! Dr. Jenkins here. This is our chapter on the peripheral nervous system. It is certainly shorter, which is good news, I suppose, but it is no less important. So it's short but sweet and very important, okay? So here we go. Now we've spent the last chapter talking about the central nervous system, which as we know is the brain and spinal cord. And as such, there's a lot of nuclei in there which do a lot of processing. But this chapter is on the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system, as we know, makes up all of the nerves in our periphery. And the function of most of these nerves in our periphery is to send nerve impulses. So it's not like the central nervous system where we do a lot of processing. Out in the periphery, the majority of the functioning is just to transmit nerve impulses to and from the brain. Now, we remember from our chapter on the nervous tissue that there are two different types of peripheral nerves. We have peripheral nerves that send information. I'll make a little brain here. And then a stick figure. Look at that. And then we'll make a brain over here. Really, I just try and find an excuse to draw. It's probably unnecessary, but I just can't help myself. So of all the peripheral nerves, we have the sensory or afferent nerves. And sensory or afferent nerves send impulses from the periphery back to the brain, versus the motor or efferent peripheral nerves send information back out from the brain out to the body, right? So all of our peripheral nerves individually, each axon is a one-way street. Either it is a sensory sending information up towards the brain, or it is a motor nerve impulse or motor neuron sending information away from the brain. And make sure you know both definitions. Sensory is also known as afferent. Some may say afferent. I say afferent. And motor is also known as efferent. I remember that because I think about E for exiting the brain. We are going to get more specific and talk about this chapter, although we're going to save the autonomic nervous system specifics, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, for our last chapter, which is on the autonomic nervous system. All right, pause for a drink there. I'm sorry. Okay, so now let's get into the specifics. The peripheral nervous system is made up of two things. The things that you think about, the peripheral nerves, are called the spinal nerves. If we remember back to the spinal cord, see, I'm always trying to get you to remember, right? There was our spinal cord, and we had a nerve coming in this way because sensory nerves come in through the back. Motor nerves come out through the front. But there was a point where these two got together, right? And this is a spinal nerve, which means that it's a bundle that contains both axons that are sensory and efferent. It's a bundle. But these are the nerves that exit from the spinal cord and go out to our body. Some of the examples of the spinal nerves we learned in lab: the sciatic nerve, the femoral nerve, the radial, ulnar, brachial, median. There's so many. But also included in the peripheral nervous system are the cranial nerves. And I mentioned this in last chapter. There's 12 of them, 12 pair. They're usually denoted by Roman numerals. And these are the ones that exit from the brainstem. So sometimes it's easy to get confused because they start so close to the brain. They start in the brainstem. Some people make the mistake of thinking that they're part of the central nervous system, but they're not. They are outside of the brain. So they are considered to be the peripheral. And as we already said, the function of all these peripheral nerves, be it cranial or spinal nerves, is communication. They simply send nerve impulses, sensory and motor. All right, Now, here's the organization, and you don't have to know rami. Don't worry about that. In lab, we talked about this a little bit. We talked about the fact that there are some peripheral nerves or spinal nerves that are arranged into a web-like pattern. And those are plexi. So we have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, which leaves by the shoulder, and we talked about a lumbosacral plexus. But a plexus is just when nerves form a web-like pattern. So sometimes our spinal nerves leave in a plexus. Other times they leave individually, right? So sometimes, like if we look down here, the spinal nerves leave individually without forming that web-like pattern. Just review that, right? Sometimes they come out individually, other times they form a web-like network, otherwise known as a plexus. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. Now, I want to point out something on this slide. The spinal nerves are named very similarly as the vertebrae themselves. So you may remember when we talked about the vertebrae in the bones chapter, we said that there were 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. But when we talk about the spinal nerves, there's one difference. And you can see it up here. In the cervical, instead of being 7 cervical nerves, there are 8. And that is not a typo. But the rest are the same. There's 12 thoracic spinal nerves and there's 5 lumbar spinal nerves. I just want to point this out so you don't think it's a typo. And let's talk about the reason why. If we're going to point it out, I might as well talk about the reason why. Otherwise, why are we even here? Although you might be asking that yourself anyway. If we talk about the thoracic and lumbar, and by the way, sacral and coccygeal also, but the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves, the nerve exits below vertebrae, or vertebra, I should say. So if we look at T1, right, here is T1 nerve. It's going to leave right below T1 vertebrae. I'm just going to put bone because I don't have enough space. So in other words, from the thoracic down, the same named nerve leaves below its same named bone. So the T1 spinal nerve exits the spinal cord below the T1 vertebra. However, in most of the cervical, the nerve exits above. So remember, in the thoracic and lumbar, nerve exits below. But in the cervical, our C1 nerve, all the way through C7, excuse me, I have allergies. These leave nerve exits above its named vertebrae or vertebra. And then it's that 8th C8 that leaves below C7. Not a huge deal, but I'm not going to ask you which ones exit above or below. But I may ask you about this, the fact that there's 8 cervical spinal nerves. That's because C1 through C7 spinal nerve exit above its same named vertebra, but then there's one C8 that exits below C7. And then all the rest, thoracic down, the spinal nerve leaves below the same named vertebra. And all this just means that we have one extra cervical spinal nerve. Pardon me. It is not a typo, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. I've already said this, that once we get away from the spinal cord, the nerves are mixed. And mixed just means that in every bundle, and what we're going to find out is, let's say this is a sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve isn't just one axon. That would be ridiculous. We have hundreds of axons. So these spinal nerves, like the sciatic or the femoral or the radial, they're actually bundles of nerves, bundles of axons. And some of the axons inside are sensory, and some of the axons inside are motor, which means that each spinal nerve is a bundle that is mixed. In this drawing, maybe we'd say black are the motor axons and green are the sensory. So they're mixed. They contain both. You do not have to know these. I'm just making a point that there are connective tissue coverings over the entire nerve bundle, over the group of axons, fascicle, and over each individual axon. Now, I know what you're saying. I can see you. Well, I can imagine. The structure of each nerve bundle looks like a muscle, doesn't it? We have the whole nerve bundle, and then we have these bundles, wait a minute, called fascicles. See, but you already know this. I'm not going to ask you that on the nervous system exam. I'm just making a point. But these are, in fact, mixed. So if we were to look at one of these bundles, some of the axons that I'm coloring in green, actually you really can't see that well, can you? Let's do red. Some of the ones that I'm coloring in may be motor, which can be red. Other ones might be black. I forgot what I said for the other one. Let's say black is motor, red is sensory. So each individual axon is only a one-way street, either sensory or motor, but the entire nerve bundle contains both. And of course, you can see in this picture, in the nerve bundle, there's blood vessels, everything that the nerve would possibly need. And this is showing you, last thing, this is showing you that most of our peripheral nerves are myelinated. They have that fatty myelin covering that gives the axon some protection, but also allows the nerve impulse to be conducted much, much faster. This is a review of what I already drew, but this is a better drawing. So we just see that as we get close to the spinal cord, it splits. These are sensory, these are motor, but the spinal nerve is over here, and it is mixed. Okay. This is what I already said. I'm ahead of myself. I just get so excited. I just want to point out that it's not a typo. We have eight cervical spinal nerves, just because of how they come out of the spinal cord. Okay. Make sure you review the plexi that we discussed in lab. We already know that there is a web-like network of spinal nerves in the cervical region called the cervical plexus. I want to point out one of the nerves, the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is really important because it supplies the diaphragm. So we know that a muscle, because the diaphragm is a muscle, we know that every muscle needs a nerve going into it in order for the muscle to contract. And here we have a case where the diaphragm is it's our biggest muscle of breathing. So this is just a particularly important nerve because this nerve goes to a muscle that we need for breathing. You know, other peripheral nerves, if you damage your radial nerve, you might lose sensation in a certain part of your forearm and hand. You might lose the ability to contract some of your forearm muscles, but you're not going to die. But if there is severe damage to the phrenic nerve and it disrupts the ability of your diaphragm to contract, you may not be able to breathe, and that could be life-threatening. Make sure you review a little bit further down. We have another plexus called the brachial plexus. You don't need to know the musculocutaneous. We did talk about the radial and ulnar. We can see those down in the forearm. Ulnar is always going to be pinky side. Radial is always going to be thumb side. I throw in here a cadaver picture, which is a human cadaver, because I want you to see in real life what this brachial plexus looks like. You know, it's right here in the shoulder, and it's actually quite superficial. If we want to label this, let's see. This is the biceps brachii, just to give you a sense of where we are. This up here is that's fat, hold on. This up here is the deltoid muscle covering the shoulder, right? Look at these. These are all spinal nerves within the brachial plexus. This is a network that's very superficial and it's very complicated. If you ever heard of a football player or any other kind of athlete, maybe, oh, excuse me, a football player may get something called a stinger if they get tackled or if they fall in a certain way where their neck bends one way and their arm bends the other, and it stretches out their shoulder. It stretches out this brachial plexus, and because of that, it can result in injury to these nerves. So it's called a burner or a stinger because these athletes will have numbness and tingling in their shoulder, maybe even going down to their arm. Usually it's not too serious. The symptoms will resolve relatively quickly. But something else to point out about these nerves, and I wish we were in person so you could have seen it in the cat muscle dissection. These nerves have a very different feel to them than blood vessels. Again, I'm so sorry. Blood vessels, you know, they feel a little bit fragile. But these nerves, they kind of feel like guitar strings. Not quite that taut, but definitely tougher than a blood vessel. So in a dissection, you can actually pick one of these nerves up with some force, and it'll be able to handle it. And that's really by design, because we know that our peripheral nerves have some ability to heal, but they heal very slowly. So our body makes them nice and tough. All right, we talked about a lumbosacral plexus, which is further down, and then I talked about the lab. The sciatic nerve goes down the posterior aspect, and it goes behind the pelvis, and the femoral nerve goes down the anterior aspect in front of the pelvis. Ooh, here's a cadaver butt. See, I have way too much fun making these, you know that. This is a butt. They've peeled back the gluteus maximus, peeled it back. And I just want to point out the sciatic nerve. This is a big one. It's a big boy. So this whole thing is the sciatic nerve. Look at that. And it has branches that will eventually branch off going all the way down our leg. You know, sciatica is when this nerve gets damaged or pinched or pulled. And in about 20% of people, this sciatic nerve runs between a muscle called the piriformis. So the piriformis in some people is split in half, and the nerve runs right through it. So if that muscle gets tight, it can really pinch the nerve, and that person will have numbness, tingling going all the way down their leg. Not a pleasant thing. All right. A couple definitions, and then we're going to move on to the second part of this. We'll briefly discuss the cranial nerves, and then we'll talk about the reflexes. Dermatomes. Make sure you know the definition. A dermatome is an area of skin that is innervated or supplied by a specific spinal nerve. And I think this is best understood by just looking at a map. You don't have to know this specifically, but once I had an athlete, I'm an athletic trainer, I had an athlete that lost feeling in their shoulder. They just simply lost feeling in the skin. And I was like, well, what's going on? Turns out that they had an injury to their C5 spinal nerve. And knowing the dermatomes, I was able to understand which spinal nerve was affected. So somewhere coming out of the spinal cord, the muscles were tight and it was pinching the C5 spinal nerve. So we can literally map out where all these spinal nerves go and supply the skin. You don't need to know this chart, but the definition: an area of skin that is supplied by a specific nerve. And then we can also define myotomes, and the prefix myo should give you a clue. We're talking about muscles. A myotome is when we describe a muscle that is innervated or supplied by a specific nerve. You don't need to know the specific ones, but just the idea. We already know that a skeletal muscle, every muscle, needs a nerve going into in order to contract. Well, you can name it. So the trapezius is supplied by the C4 spinal nerve. So if someone had a complete inability to contract their trapezius, they may have damage to their C4 spinal nerve. Their triceps brachii is supplied by C7. Okay, so just know the definitions. You don't need to know the specifics. Alrighty, my friends. You do not need to know all the cranial nerves. I know some of my colleagues have students memorize them. I don't think it's necessary right now. I am going to ask you to know a couple of them, but not all 12. So there's 12 pair. Most of them come out of the brainstem. Some of the cranial nerve bundles are sensory only, some are motor only, and some are mixed. Here is a list. The ones that I'd like you to know are the ones that we learned in lab: olfactory, optic, and vagus. I believe I said in the lab video the saying to remember them. The stupid saying that I've remembered since 20 years ago: O, to touch and feel, very green vegetables say hi. O, olfactory, optic, oculomotor. To touch and feel, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, and so forth. There's another one on Old Olympus, top something, I don't know. And then there's also a saying to remember whether it's sensory, motor, or both. Some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter more, something, big brains matter more, I don't know. I just want you to know where the olfactory, optic, and vagus nerve goes. The olfactory is a sensory nerve for smell. The optic is a sensory nerve for vision. The vagus, this is a biggie. The vagus nerve, of course, is a mixed nerve, sensory and motor, and it goes all the way down to everything. It is possible to test cranial nerves, so if someone loses the ability to smell, it could be a problem with their nose, but it's also possible that their nose is absolutely fine, and the problem is the nerve going from the nose to the brain. Okay, but you don't need to know these for my class. I wanted to show you this picture. The vagus nerve, it is our 10th cranial nerve. It starts way up in the brainstem, but look at all these yellow branches. So the important thing is that the vagus nerve has branches that go everywhere. Our trachea, our esophagus, heart, lungs, our gut, everywhere. The vagus nerve, of course, has parasympathetic effects, right? So when we stimulate or when we send a nerve impulse down the vagus nerve, it lowers heart rate and blood pressure, but conversely will increase GI tract and kidney activity. So you should know that. And we're going to talk much more about that in A&P 2. Cool. You don't need to know this. I'm just giving you some clinical applications. We can use vagolytic medications, which is a medication that will inhibit the vagus nerve. So this could be a treatment for bradycardia, a slow heart rate. If you inhibit something that usually slows down heart rate, then the net result is that heart rate stays high. Or sometimes we can use vagus nerve stimulation to slow down the body to control the seizure, for example. But you don't need to know that. All right. The last part of this chapter, we're going to talk more about reflexes. I know that we talked about them in lab, but we're going to add just a little bit more onto them. We already know what a reflex is. It is a rapid response to a stimulus. We know the function of our reflexes is for protection. And we know the 5 steps of the reflex arc. Know those from lab, please review for lecture. Here we go, there's a stimulus. In this case, it's a pinprick to the skin. There is some kind of receptor that senses it. There's a sensory neuron that will transmit that information to the spinal cord. There is processing. Many of our reflexes are processed at the spinal cord, which makes them even faster. Even though the brain gets notified after the initial processing, in many instances, the initial processing can happen in the spinal cord, that's why it's so fast. Then we have a motor impulse going back out to an effector, which is a muscle that carries out whatever it is that is our protective response. In this case, it would be the muscles that would be needed to pull the hand away from the stimulus. All a review, that's why I'm talking so quickly. But here we go. Here's where we talk about more specifics. There are 2 types of reflexes. The one that we talked about in lab is considered to be a somatic reflex. Anytime we're talking about somatic reflexes, the effector is skeletal muscle. In our last chapter of the semester, in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to be talking about autonomic reflexes. And as the name suggests, autonomic, automatic, the effector is going to be smooth or cardiac muscle, because smooth and cardiac muscle is involuntarily controlled, or it's automatic. We're going to focus on the somatic in this chapter, but I want to introduce the autonomic because that's going to be the basis of our discussion for the autonomic nervous system. Okay, but the effector, if the effector is skeletal muscle, it is a somatic reflex. We talked about in the lab the knee-jerk reflex or patellar reflex. This is an example of a stretch reflex. The stimulus was excuse me. The stimulus was pressure put on the patellar tendon. And I talked about this in the lab video. Even though when your knee is bent like this, you're really not at danger. But when your knee is bent like that, this tendon is stretched. So even though you don't feel like you're at danger, and you're really not, theoretically, if we continued to bend our knee, to flex our knee, we could overstretch this tendon and we could break it. So in response to this stimulus, we have processing at the spinal cord, which sends a motor impulse back out to our quads, which is the effector skeletal muscle. The quads contract to straighten the leg because that is a protective mechanism against overstretching. Let me give you a better example of this. It's a little more fun when we're in person, but I think everyone can relate to this. A better example of the stretch reflex. I'm sure in a class, not mine, haha, in a class or when you're sitting in front of the TV or God forbid if it's at work and you're tired. So even though you're sitting up, you're tired and you may even start to doze off. And you know what happens when you doze off. I'm doing it right now. your neck starts to droop forward. And eventually what happens? You wake up. Well, you actually don't wake up first. The stretch reflex kicks in first, and the stretch reflex is what wakes you up. Imagine the muscles and the tendons of those muscles in the back of your neck, the trapezius, for example. When your neck starts to bend forward or flex forward, the muscles on your back get stretched. And as a protection against overstretching, at a certain point in time, those back muscles stretch so much that it triggers a stretch reflex, which automatically, reflexively triggers you to contract those back muscles to put your head back up. We've all had this happen to us. Perfect example of a stretch reflex. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit specific on some of the specifics of the receptors in these reflexes and then the effectors. But before we do that, and this is, by the way, we're almost done. This is the last point to get through. But before we do that, let me just introduce the other examples of reflexes. So our stretch reflex we talked about, and then a little bit later, we're going to talk about the muscle spindle that's involved in a stretch reflex. But before I do that, let's give another example. This example makes so much sense. It's so easy. A flexor withdrawal. If you reach out towards a painful stimulus, like if you touch this hot pan, what is your reflexive response going to be? To withdraw. And in order to withdraw, usually you have to contract flexor muscles. In this case, it would be the flexors at your elbow. So this would be an example of a simple flexor withdrawal reflex. You're exposed to a painful stimulus. Think about when you step on something in the middle of the night. You get up to use the bathroom and your kid's damn Lego toy is on the floor and you step on it. Or you hit your toe on the corner of the coffee table. You have a reflexive response to flex that body part away from the stimulus. Yeah, flexor withdrawal stimulus. Perfect. What goes along with the flexor withdrawal, the other side of your body has a crossed extensor. So these two work together. While the limb that is experiencing the stimulus, that limb will flex to withdraw, the opposing limb usually extends to help stabilize you. So these go together. Think about stepping on that toy or stubbing your toe on the end of the coffee table. The side of the limb with the stimulus flexes to withdraw, but the opposite limb better extends so you stand up. It stabilizes you. Can you imagine if both of your legs, when you stepped on a stimulus, was just one leg? Can you imagine what would happen if both of your legs flexed? You'd fall to your knees. So this is a built-in protective mechanism. If we have a limb, arm or leg, that experiences a painful stimulus or dangerous stimulus, that side of the limb flexor withdrawals away, but the opposing limb, crossed extensor, it extends to stabilize you. And this is going to involve a Golgi tendon organ. Now I'm going to make a little review here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Quick note. Good. So we're going to make a little review sheet here. We're going to talk about the stretch reflex and flexor withdrawal, right? I want to use red. And this is our last topic, so bear with me. So we have a stretch reflex, and we have the flexor withdrawal, which, by the way, goes along with the crossed extensor. I'm just writing that just to save myself. So let's make a little table here. We want to talk about the type of receptor. When we looked at the reflex arc, right? When we looked at the reflex arc, the first thing that has to happen is we have to have a receptor that senses that stimuli. Well, let me introduce you to some of the specific receptors. In the stretch reflex, we have a specific receptor called a muscle spindle. So this is just an example of a specific type of receptor. And we have specific receptors everywhere. All right? So our receptor type is called the muscle spindle. And I want to make a little more space here because I have more to add than I've remembered, but that's okay. More learning is always a good thing. I want to talk about the location of the receptor. And I want to talk about what the receptor is sensitive to, or what receptor responds to. And lastly, we're going to talk about, how do I want to say this? When stimulated, receptor type, where it's located, what it responds to, and resulting action. We're only going to talk about two specific receptors, and they're kind of opposite, so it's really not going to be as bad as you think. So one receptor type that is utilized in the stretch reflex is called a muscle spindle. The muscle spindle are wrapped around these muscle fibers. Okay? So just imagine these specialized things wrapped around the muscle fibers. The muscle spindles are located in the muscle belly. We can see that, right? The muscle belly is right in the middle. So if I go back to this, the muscle spindle is the receptor that's specialized for the stretch reflex. It is located in the muscle belly. My stomach is growling at me. I hope you can't hear that. It's kind of embarrassing. And the muscle spindle, which is located in the muscle belly, is sensitive to changes in length, which we already talked about because we said this was a stretch reflex. When a muscle or tendon is getting too stretched, it's getting too long, this muscle spindle will sense that. So the muscle spindle is responsive to muscle length. Great example of how specific these receptors are. And when the muscle spindle is activated because there's too much of an increase in length, the response is to contract that muscle. Contraction of muscle. In the example of the patellar tendon reflex, right? We use the patellar tendon to hit, we use the reflex hammer to hit the patellar tendon, and the muscle spindle was activated. It was sensing that increase in stretch of the tendon. That muscle spindle is located in the quadricep muscle belly, and in response, it contracts. That's what was happening here, right? The muscle spindle is located in the muscle belly. It senses too much length, that there's an overstretch, and the response is to contract the muscle, in this case, which will kick the leg out to make the tendon shorter, because the initial problem was that it was being stretched too much. Now what we're going to find is, in the flexor withdrawal and crossed extensor, we have another type of specialized receptor called the Golgi tendon organ. And it's just going to be kind of the opposite from the muscle spindle. So here we see a muscle. We just talked about the muscle spindles that are in the muscle belly. But now we're talking about something called Golgi tendon organs. And these specialized receptors are located in the tendon. So our receptor type is something called the Golgi tendon organ, GTO. No, it's not a Mustang. And the GTOs are located in the muscle tendon. So the muscle's going to have both, the muscle spindles in the belly, which sense changes in length, and it's going to have the GTOs, or Golgi tendon organs, in the tendon. And the Golgi tendon organs are responsive to changes in tension, or you may also think of this as pressure. Responsive to pressure. And I could probably add to this, the muscle spindle is receptive to too much muscle length when it gets too long. Accordingly, the GTO is receptive or senses too much pressure. And the response is a relaxation of muscles. This is true in the flexor withdrawal, that when we have painful stimulus, we relax the muscle to pull it away from the stimulus. But another example of when a Golgi tendon organ is active is if you're trying to lift a weight that's too heavy. So imagine doing a bench press, and the first couple reps, you're like, yeah, I got this. But then it gets really hard because your muscles are fatigued. Well, at a certain point, if your Golgi tendon organs in the tendons sense so much weight, so much pressure, that the muscle is about to be at failure, before your muscle rips away from the bone, usually you're going to have a reflexive response where you just let go. That's why you have a spotter. Now, I know I showed you a picture of my cousin who actually tore his biceps away. So this reflex isn't always going to work, but it usually does. So if you have too much pressure on a muscle, the worst case scenario is that there's ultimate failure and the muscle and tendon pull away from the bone. So as a reflexive protective mechanism, when the Golgi tendon organs sense too much pressure, they will reflexively relax the muscle. You drop the weight, hopefully not on yourself. So if you know that chart, excuse me, the differences between the muscle spindle and the GTO, you'll be good as gold. All right, you don't need to know these. I did talk about a burner, but you don't need to know that. And then just one last word to end off this chapter. We know the central nervous system cannot heal, right? But in the periphery, some, right? So in peripheral nerves, we do have some ability to heal. You know, if you damage a peripheral nerve, it can heal, but it's very slow. You don't need to know this number, but it gives you a sense of how slow. All right, folks, study hard, keep working hard. We're almost to the end.